to our spotlight for this week of our interview with Drew Karpyshyn.
Here we go.
Hey, how you doing?
I am doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well.
So what we have is we have questions from our listeners. You have questions from me, and of course, if there's any that you don't want to answer, just say no answer, as always.
Pass.
Yeah. So we're just going to be divided up in this basically three sections. One about like your original stuff with BioWare, and then your stuff with Star Wars, and then your current projects.
Sure, that sounds good.
So I guess the first question is, it said that you started off as a truant officer, and then you got into working with video games. How did that transition work? How did you go from doing that?
I wasn't a truant officer, I was a loan officer.
Loan officer, sorry. And then you went back to college and then started working on video games. How did that transition work?
So I had sort of fallen into banking as just a way to pay the bills, and actually kind of a lucky accident literally happened to me. I was sitting at a stoplight and somebody ran into my car, and it was a total write-off, and I took the insurance money from that accident and I used it to pay for going back to school so I could work on my master's in English, which is really my true passion. And while I was at the University of Alberta, which is where I live, in Edmonton, there was a little ad in the English department newsletter for a video game company that was looking for writers to work on a Dungeons and Dragons themed video game. And that company was BioWare, which was also founded in Edmonton, my hometown, the town where I grew up. So it was really kind of just being in the right place at the right time. I saw that ad. I was working on a Forgotten Realms Dungeons and Dragons novel already. I contacted the company thinking, this might be a little small contract that I can, get a few dollars out of, and it turned into the greatest career I ever had. So.
Which novel were you working on at the time?
I was working on a novel called Temple Hill. That was my first novel that was published way back in 2000. It actually came out around the same time as the third Baldur's Gate novel, which I wrote after joining BioWare, but they kind of wanted to try and publish it at the same time as the game. So they published those first two novels in the same month, even though they were written, about 6 months apart.
And did you get to write the third Baldur's Gate novel because you were already working on that series?
Yeah, so what had happened was the first two novels written by a different author. Quite honestly, they weren't necessarily resonating with the fan base. So the publishers, Wizards of the Coast, said, well, we like your other Dungeons and Dragons novel, and you're working on the video game, so you should know the story better than anybody. So why don't you take a crack at the third novel? Which I did, is the Throne of Ball novel, which was a very interesting experience because writing a novel based on a BioWare game, directly based on a BioWare game, is a very, very difficult task just because of the scope of the games.
So did they say why they had you write the third one instead of, I think the first two were written by Philip Athens? I think he wrote the first two books in that series.
Yeah, and I think partly it was a scheduling issue, and I think they were looking to take maybe the series in a different direction. I think they were thinking, giving the novel someone who's actually working on the game just made a lot of sense as well. Because, I would be able to sort of adjust to any changes in the storyline more quickly. Game stories are constantly being edited and rewritten as we make the games. And for an author who's working on a tie-in novel, it's tough for them to, react to those changes quickly enough if they are part of that process.
And so I guess that leads into my next question. With Baldur's Gate and so on, because when you wrote Mass Effect books, you did their separate books. But with Baldur's Gate, you're actually working an adaptation of a video game, a game that has hours and hours and hours of content and different choices. How did you end up deciding which decisions to make, which direction to go, other than, of course, the decisions already made in the first two novels?
Yeah, so, obviously, as you said, I had to carry forward some of the decisions made in the first two novels. But I basically had to try and, condense everything down. You can't bring in 10 squad members in a book like that because there's not enough pages. You have to say, well, I'm going to have, 2 or 3 of the party members join you, and maybe all the, villains or all the incidents that happen in the book have to be cut. So it's really a matter of just sort of trying to pick and choose the main elements of the critical paths to the game's story. Unfortunately, what makes the game so popular is all the extra stuff. So when you do a book like that, you often leave out things players want to know about, which is why when we went to do the Mass Effect books, I said, well, I don't want to do a novelization of the game's story because it won't do it justice. What I'd rather do, and what we did, was take that universe and tell other stories that maybe had some relation to what happened in the game or tangentially connected, but told their own story in a format that was more appropriate for a novel.
Oh, that's actually pretty awesome. And then leading into the Mass Effect books, I guess we'll talk a little bit about Mass Effect before going back to Star Wars a little bit. So with Mass Effect, you created this massive world. So with that very, very first game that you guys were writing, do you guys have any idea it would turn into a trilogy at that time, or is it just your goal is to make one solid space RPG?
We actually started out planning it to be a trilogy, and we had mapped out in very broad strokes the directions we wanted to take the game. We kind of looked at it as using some of the classic 3-act structure rules from film and classic literature, and we kind of knew, okay, within each game we're going to sort of have your first game. It will be its own complete story, but there will be something that leads into the second game, and the second game will be the traditional dark middle chapter, which might have a little more grimness to it, and we've mapped out a lot of stuff. But we also wanted to make sure we had the flexibility to change the story, add or remove things, or focus on things that fans wanted. A good example of that is Cerberus. We didn't know they would become as popular as they did. We in our original outlines, they were a very minor element. They were just this throwaway human radical group that we could bring in whenever we needed a villain. And by the second game, of course, they became a central component to the entire story. So it's a very difficult way to do it, but you need to have a roadmap that also allows you the flexibility to go off course.
So being, one of the head writers for that, for some of the games in that one, do you have any of the characters that were, say, nearest and dearest to you that you really connected with or really enjoyed?
Well, for the game, I really liked writing, when I was writing them, I really enjoyed doing Liara and Tali. I did a lot of work with them. Those were probably two of my favorite characters to write. And as for a character that I didn't actually do a lot of writing with, I helped come up with a concept, but another author named Patrick Weeks really took him around with him, was Morgan Solus, who first appeared in the second game, the Solarian scientist. And as for characters that I didn't work on, he's probably my favorite character. I just think he's an incredibly written character that combines humor and some gravity and some pathos and everything all rolled up into one.
So were any of these characters created with a certain voice actor or a certain voice in mind, or were they created and then they found actors that sort of lent to them?
It's mostly we create the character and then try to find an appropriate voice actor. Although if we see something that fits well, we do have the flexibility to go back and sort of massage or tweak the characters. For example, especially if you get a very well-known actor, Martin Sheen for The Elusive Man or Seth Green for Joker, once we knew who those actors were going to be, we want to make full use of their talents, and we kind of, tweak the characters to try and give them as much room to use their incredible ability as we can. But in a lot of other cases, we would just look for a voice actor, and once you have that voice actor in place as a writer, it's easier for you because you can imagine that actor's reading the lines and saying the lines, and it's easier to tell what works and what doesn't work, because often we start casting before we've finished the entire writing. There's so much dialogue that we need to begin the voice recording process before all the dialogue is finally locked down. So you're always doing rewrites, and if you've got a voice actor who you've heard their early sessions, it makes it a lot easier as a writer because you can picture that in your head, or listen to it in your head.
So with Mass Effect, what were some of the biggest challenges you guys had when it came to writing, and especially when it came to Mass Effect 2? What were some of the biggest things that you really had to struggle on to get right?
Well, so with Mass Effect 2, I think the biggest thing for me was the escalation. it's very difficult to escalate from an omnipotent, all-powerful, essentially technological version of an old one, of a god, of a Cthulhu god coming back. So, it's difficult to sort of get that same sense of dread and take things to the next level. That's always the difficulty when you're doing a sequel or continuing a trilogy that has a complete story in the first section. You need to find a new story to tell, and it has to tie in with the first one, but it still has to push everything to another level. I think one of the big advantages that helped us do that was adding Cerberus into the mix, because it gave us sort of a different perspective. It gave us a different direction to come at the story. And anyone who's played the game knows they became a huge focus of the game. I mean, they're essential element to everything that happens. So I think that's one of the keys, is you have to find, for want of a better term, the hook for the second game as well. The first game, the hook was Mass Effect. It was Mass Effect. It was new. We're introducing this universe. The second game, we had to find what was the thing about the universe that people knew about but wanted to know more about. And, that's not always easy to as an artist, to wrap your head around what the audience is going to love.
And so as a writer for games like Mass Effect and so on, how, when you guys end up writing these things, how structured is your script? Because when you have a book, you have a very structured story and it goes in a certain direction. When it comes to writing a game, it's a lot more loose, a lot more, I can't come up with the right word, but it's not as tied down. So do you find it difficult to write this way?
Well, especially for BioWare games, we have this branching dialogue where you can take the script and take the story in multiple directions. You can be a Paragon or Renegade, or with our Star Wars games, you can be light side, dark side, and we try to reflect that in the story, but we still have to have some momentum of moving the entire story forward. So it really is about striking a balance between giving players options and choice, and still being able to propel the narrative forward. The only way to do that is, as you said, to have sort of a more loose version of the story. It gives you a little bit less creative control as an author, because you can't do as many intricate, diabolically brilliant twists and turns in the plot, because you don't know for sure what players are going to do, what they're going to see. You can't foreshadow things quite in the same way that you would in, say, a novel or a film. But the advantage is, because players get more input into the story, they're controlling the action, what you do put in there resonates so deeply with players. They feel like they are much more involved than, say, in a book or a film, because they're actually partaking in the action. They're an active participant in the story. So it's a kind of a trade-off. They're different, definitely different mediums, and there's good and bad with both. I always use the analogy that a novel is a lot deeper than a game. A game is going to be shallower, but it's going to be much, much wider. There's going to be a lot more in the game that you can do.
Would you say anyone involved was inspired by, say, the old Choose Your Own Adventure novels from the 80s and 90s style?
I think all the writers at BioWare and the designers and everybody who worked on the game, has had experience with those Choose Your Own Adventures novels in their past. And at its most basic level, that's kind of what our games are. With the technology, obviously, you can be a little more advanced in those books. It's not as simple as turn to page 58 and continue. But that is at the core what we were doing. And I think pretty much every writer who worked on the games has had read, played, I'm not even sure what the term is, those Choose Your Own Adventure books. So that's something that we tried to sort of capture and bring into a more modern version with the BioWare games.
Okay, so one last question involving Mass Effect before we move on to Star Wars. A lot of us heard your interview with VGS this past summer about the ending of Mass Effect 3, and you don't work on the series anymore. But has anyone discussed, or do you have any ideas of where you'd like to see it go from what we've already seen? We know the end of Shepard, so any ideas where you'd like to see it go from here?
Well, I'm always leery about speaking out like this, because when you're not part of the team, it's very easy to say, well, here's what I would do, and you sound like a genius. And it's a much more complicated process. Anyone who's been involved in that knows that there's so many factors that go in. For me personally, I'm not even sure what they're going to do. Part of me wants to see Shepard return because, Shepard is so iconic and then tied into the series. On the other hand, it's difficult if that's not, if that doesn't work for what they're trying to do, maybe you need to take things in a whole different direction. I think there's something interesting in looking at a universe that doesn't have the math relays working anymore and how that impacts it. And if they want to go in that direction, I think the natural logical step is to make the first game about trying to, get the math relay network working again if that's possible. But, again, I don't know. The other option is they might want to do something that's more of a prequel. A lot of people are interested in what happened sort of before the events of Mass Effect, the First Contact War, things like that. The great thing about the Mass Effect universe is it's so detailed and it's so vast and so rich that there's a lot of different ideas out there that you could grab onto that I think would make a great story and a great game. And it really is a matter of just getting the team to sort of focus on the right idea. And I'm confident that the people involved are going to do that. So I'm actually very interested to see what direction they take it in myself.
I just want the hero to be a Krogan Spectre. I think that would be awesome.
Yeah.
There's actually one question I forgot to ask, which I actually promised someone I would ask. Well, what was your inspiration for Tali?
I think in a general term, she was inspired in the same way that a lot of the other, BioWare romantic characters from the early games were. Someone like Aerie, or sort of the younger, innocent, somebody going out and sort of exploring their first, adventures away from home, sort of the rite of passage. But I don't think there was necessarily a direct influence that I could point to in my head. Like, there wasn't someone that it was an homage to or anything like that. We wanted to make her, a young but capable character who's bringing sort of a different world perspective, someone who's on their sort of, their rite of passage into adulthood, but also make her a very strong and independent female character as well. And then the romance sort of came out of that afterwards. That wasn't our initial plans, although we always knew there would be some appeal. So it was kind of the character growing based on what fans liked about her and how they reacted to her, and that's kind of why we pushed her in that direction eventually.
Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit to Star Wars. You started off with the Star Wars universe by working on Knights of the Old Republic. When you and Casey Hudson and the rest of the team got together to start planning that game, did you guys have any idea it would be what's basically the Star Wars game of the past 10 years that people refer to? It's always on the top of people's list. Did you guys have any idea it would get to be like that?
So that was the first game that I was sort of a lead writer on. So when we started working on the game, we had a really accomplished team. Casey Hudson has a great track record. Mass Effect, KOTOR, everyone knows his abilities. James Owen was involved, who was involved with the Baldur's Gate games and Neverwinter Nights and Dragon Age, as well as KOTOR. He's an incredible Star Wars fan. I've seen him win the Star Wars Trivial Pursuit game in one turn, without missing a question. And we had an incredibly talented team of writers and artists and designers on it. So we knew it was a very good team. You could tell that very early in the project. But you never know something's going to be a huge hit. And I actually remember working on the game, and I was, enjoying it. And once they added the music, and I was playing through levels that we had written, and we had music and art, and, some of that stuff was coming together. I think it was probably 6 months before we actually shipped the game. It just clicked. I was enjoying it. It was fine. But once they put in the music to sort of fill out that atmosphere, I was like, wow, this feels like being in, a Star Wars movie set before the actual, any of the films that are out there. It feels like I'm in the Star Wars universe. Wow, this is going to be huge. People are going to love this. It was a weird feeling because I hadn't had that, it's fairly new to the industry. And I could tell it was going to be a hit. I knew people would love it. And I actually mentioned that, and other people were, wow, let's keep our expectations realistic. It's a tough industry. You never know what's going to happen. But it really gave me a lot of confidence, and it kind of helped propel me through the long crunch time toward the end of the game to get it out, because at that point, I just knew with the talent we had in there, so many great things in the game, I knew it was going to be a huge hit. And that might sound arrogant, but sometimes you just know.
So, as a fan of Star Wars, which of course all of you working on the game were, which Star Wars elements were your favorite to put into that game?
So one of the things I really liked about being able to work with Star Wars is I like to take their philosophies, the dark side, the light side, and look at them as ways that we can sort of, how do we re-envision these philosophies? And I like to play with the balance between dark and light. I mean, these are the classic thing in the movies. Yoda and Luke have that great scene on Dagobah where he goes into the cave and encounters Darth Vader, and Yoda talks about fear leading to the dark side, and you're walking such a thin line, especially when you're in a situation where, as say a Jedi, you have to use your abilities to fight somebody and quite possibly end their life. It's a very difficult thing to do if you're truly a proponent of the light side. So that balance between light and dark is what I find the most interesting, which is why with the character of Revan, it was perfect because we could let players explore that and go one direction or the other, or sort of walk the middle line. And for me, that's one of the key things of Star Wars. It's the morality that on the surface sounds simple, light side, dark side, are you good or evil? But as you delve into it, you realize it's much more complicated and intricate than that. And that's one of the things for me personally I love about the Star Wars universe.
Okay, so how did you go from writing KOTOR to writing the Darth Bane trilogy? Did they find you, or did you apply to them?
So I actually I'd written the Forgotten Realms novels, a couple Dungeons and Dragons novels, and we were working on Knights of the Old Republic, and we were at Gen Con, the big convention in Milwaukee. It was still in Milwaukee at that time. And Knights of the Old Republic had not come out yet. I was there helping with the team that was demoing Neverwinter Nights. And this was already after I knew Knights of the Republic was going to be a big success. And the editor, Shelley Shapiro, who is the Star Wars editor for Del Rey, was there. And I went up and I spoke to her. She was working the booth. There was Star Wars authors there. And I kind of introduced myself and told her, I was an author and I had these books and I was working on the Star Wars game and I would love to write a book in the Star Wars universe. And, to her credit, she was very polite and helpful and, said, well, send me some of your books and look at them. I'm sure at something like Gen Con where there's 30,000 fans, she gets 100 people a day coming up to her and saying stuff like this, like, I want to write for Star Wars. So she gave me her contact info. I sent the books in. And then I didn't really hear anything for several months, which I wasn't that surprised by. I kind of thought it was a long shot. But once KOTOR came out and it became this phenomenon, it attracted a lot of attention. I was lucky to have my name very prominently associated with the game as the lead writer. A lot of people were very impressed with the story. We had set it in an old republic, which was an era that wasn't as explored, especially in the novels. I think all those factors together kind of gave me a leg up. And Shelley looked at my novels and contacted me back and said, hey, we want to do an Old Republic novel. Are you interested? To which, of course, I said yes, 1,000 times yes. And that's where we began.
So the character of Darth Bane was one that was created by George Lucas. I believe it's mentioned in Phantom Menace, or at least the novelization for Phantom Menace. Did you get any aid from George Lucas or Lucasfilm when it came to writing those books, and how much involvement did they have?
So the book side of things, unless it's one of the novelizations of the films, you don't really get any input from the man. George Lucas doesn't delve into the books too often. The book department kind of does its own thing. There are people that you need to get things approved by. There's people who check to make sure that everything fits in the continuity. But the books are sort of their own thing. They're usually set a little bit apart from the films. So he's not involved in that directly. You do get a lot of support and guidance from the people at at both Del Rey and Star Wars. If you need reference material, anything like that, They were great. This is sort of before the days of like Wikipedia or the online wikis. So, you needed ways to reference everything that had been printed or written or created. For me, with the Darth Bane book, because it was Old Republic, there wasn't as much out there, but it was also building on a storyline introduced in a series of comics. I believe the author was a man named Darko McCann. I might be wrong about that, but there was these comics, these Tales of the Jedi comics that focused on some children who were caught up in the war between the Brotherhood of Darkness and General Hoth's Army of Light. And in those comics, the figure of Darth Bane was actually introduced. He's kind of a minor character who sort of works around the shadows, but he was a character I found very interesting, and he kind of fit in with what I wanted to do with the Old Republic. So I said, with the editors, we decided this is a good character to focus on. So some of what happens in the first Darth Bane novel is actually recounted in those comics, but from a different perspective. And one of the main characters in the comics is a little girl named Rain, who obviously goes on to become Xana in the later novels. So I didn't invent Darth Bane, but there wasn't a lot about him. He was fairly undeveloped character that I was able to take with and run with. And, I kind of thought it fit for him, but I always want to make sure people understand, he already existed in the Star Wars universe. I just got the privilege of getting to, take him and make him my central character.
Okay, and then a lot of your other work with Star Wars has been, of course, the Old Republic based, with especially with Revan and with the Old Republic novels. So a couple of questions to do with that. The first one is, you were you helped with the Old Republic, but not as a head writer or anything like that. You were an advisor, I believe, is what Hal Hood said. What exactly was your involvement with the writing of the Old Republic?
So with the Old Republic massive multiplayer online game, the MMO, I came in sort of after a lot of the game had been written. It was a huge writing team. It was a massive project. The amount of material in there is mind-boggling. It's staggering. It's about there's every character class in there, and there's 8 classes, has more content than the original KOTOR. So it's huge. It's 8, 9, 10 times as big as what we did with the original Knights of the Old Republic. So they were already well into development by the time I came in. At BioWare, we always want to support other teams on other projects, but it's difficult because you're focused on your own project so much, trying to get it out. So there was mild sort of input from us, but most of it was done by that particular team. Once I joined that team, I moved down to Austin from Edmonton because that's where that team was based. And I came on, and at that point, my role was really just to help create content. I did write some stuff for the Revan Flashpoint. I did a lot of work on the Jedi Knight storyline, picking up from one of the other authors who had started it, and named Hal Hood, who's a very accomplished writer at BioWare. There's a lot of great stuff on Star Wars, The Old Republic. He was doing multiple characters. He was doing the Smuggler and the Jedi Knight, and it was really more about me just sort of picking up pieces wherever I could to help the team, make the game as good as they could, get it out, as soon as we could, get everything done. So I was really just sort of one tiny cog in that giant machine. And of course, whenever I could, I would offer whatever insights I could on Star Wars or the way we've done things. But, the team was very well established, and it was a lot of talented people who were doing good work already. So it's not like, I needed to go in there and change anything. I just kind of had to find my way to fit in with what was already going on.
Okay, so you mentioned working a bit with Revan. So one of the questions we have from a fan is, have we seen the last of Revan in the game universe that you know of? Because he disappears, and I believe we see him disappear in a flash rather than his actual death. Do you think that's the end of Revan as far as what we get to see?
So I'll preface this by saying I'm not working at BioWare anymore. I did retire to focus on my novels, so I don't know for sure what they're planning. But there's a definite reason we don't let you kick Revan's body and loot it at the end. We didn't want to shut that door. We wanted to make sure, and people who, as you mentioned, people who pay attention realize you don't actually kill him. He disappears, in bold light. We don't really get into exactly what happened or how he did it, but there isn't a kill shot. There's no final blow. There's no body. As a general rule in Star Wars or just anything like that, if there's no body, there's always a chance they could come back. And again, I don't know for sure what the plans are. I don't want to, say this is what they're doing or this is what I think they should do because I'm not directly involved anymore. But as popular as Revan is and as rich as that character is and with as much potential as that character has, I wouldn't be shocked if someday, somewhere, somehow, in some form, you do see Revan coming back again. Now, again, it's all unofficial. Don't
yeah, definitely unofficial.
I don't want anyone to take this as gospel, but yeah, I would not be shocked at all if Revan makes some kind of return down the road.
Star Wars fans are going to take this as utter gospel and spread it everywhere.
Yeah, I know. But
now we just have to say you're cast in episode 7 and all of a sudden one more question to do with Star Wars before we go on to your current projects. This one, I have really no idea how much you could actually answer, but a listener wants to know, since you've worked with a lot of Star Wars novels, including once very recently, do you think that Disney taking over has changed Star Wars at all, or is going to change Star Wars a lot, or is it just going to be the same old Star Wars as far as your mind goes or as writing goes?
So first of all, I think for the book department, it's not going to be a huge change. As I said, the books and films are kind of handled separately, and the book department is kind of doing its own thing. I mean, there's obviously coordination between them. But from everything I've heard and my experience with after Disney took over, admittedly, it was limited because most of my work on Annihilation was already done. It hasn't been a huge change on the book department. The films, I was never directly involved in the films, so I don't know what the process is going to be, but I was encouraged by how Disney handled the Marvel franchise. They owned the Marvel franchise, and they basically brought us the Avengers movie, which I thought was an excellent movie. I think they handled everything very well. It's very difficult to juggle those kinds of characters and that many characters and still come up with something that fans will like, and I thought they did an excellent job of that. So I have a lot of hope for that. The people involved, J.J. Abrams, again, he seems to, be able to, with the Star Trek franchise, he's able to tap into some of the things that fans want to see and still bring to a broader audience. I think with the people involved and their track record, Disney's track record with the Avengers, I'm not panicking. I'm not in panic mode by any means. I think they're going to do some really interesting stuff. Anytime you do something the scope of a Star Wars, you have the weight of a billion worlds on your shoulders. So, there's always going to be that kind of pressure and that group of people who are, afraid they're going to ruin everything they love. But I think things are going to work out pretty well. I'm fairly optimistic.
Okay, so now we can move on to the last section about your current stuff. So you left BioWare a few years ago to pursue your current passions, your current projects. So what are some of the things that you've been working on since you left BioWare?
So the main focus, I left BioWare, it's going to be close to 2 years. It's, I think, 18 or 20 months right now. I left to focus initially on a series, a fantasy trilogy that I've been sort of working off and on for quite a long time. The trilogy is called The Chaosborn. It's a classic sort of in the vein of Tolkien or Terry Brooks or David Eddings, those kinds of fantasies that I grew up reading, sword and sorcery, if you want to call it that. It has sort of the influences of George Martin Game of Thrones. There's lots of characters. There's a lot of moral ambiguity. But for me, I always felt like I loved reading fantasy novels, but some of them would bog down. They would slow down. They have these big elaborate scenes where they gather on a campfire and sing poetry, or they go to a giant feast and you get every dish that's being served. And I always felt like I wanted to keep the action going. I'd skim those parts. So I thought, I want to write the fantasy novel that I want to read. It has all the great stuff from those authors that I loved, but I'm going to put my own sort of take on it, my own sort of action fantasy version. Anyone who's read my novels knows I like to keep the action moving, I keep the pacing going. So the first book, Children of Fire, which is out now, it came out back in August, was really sort of something I've been working on for many years off and on, but I never had the time to sort of focus on it and finish it off. Now that it's out, it's getting really good reviews. Fans really like it. It's come to my attention that there's actually a fair bit of sort of my horror influences in there, which I didn't consciously do, but I read a lot of Stephen King growing up, and I think some of that's crept in. So, it's sort of a darker fantasy with a little bit of horror elements, but it's something that I really am very proud of. I've kept it moving, kept the action moving, kept the story going. I think people are really going to find it a kind of book that they say pick up, they won't be able to put down. And the second book, The Scorched Earth, is coming out in July. And then the third book I'm already working on. So once I'm done this trilogy, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. That's an open door, but it's going to be probably another 6 to 9 months before I finish the third book, and then sort of look at what my options are.
Awesome, because all your previous novels, at least that I'm aware of, have all been part of big universes, video game franchises, previous established universes. Did you find it refreshing to write something in your own sandbox, or was it a bit daunting at first to step out of other people's sandboxes into your own?
Well, I'm going to take the easy answer, say it was both. It was very exciting, but also a little bit terrifying. Creating your own universe, your own world, or your own setting it's something that's fun. I think, anyone who's ever tried to write any kind of science fiction or fantasy world knows that there's a lot of appeal to that. You get to be the giant god creating everything. But there's also an enormous amount of pressure and responsibility. You want to make sure everything fits. You want to make sure you create something that you love, but that other people are also going to love. With Mass Effect, we created an entire universe. We spent roughly a year sort of fleshing it out. But there's other members of the team all contributing. So you kind of had input from a large number of people, and you could get feedback from a large number of people to know how it was going. With the Children of Fire novel, and the world I created for the Chaosborn trilogy, I didn't really have that kind of feedback. I had to trust my instincts. And, I feel like my instincts are good, but there's always in your back of your mind that little seed of doubt that, is this really good, or am I kidding myself? Are people going to like this, or am I just, filling up the page with words that they're not even going to want to read? So it's a little bit nerve-wracking, but, having that kind of creative control, being able to do exactly what I want in the tone I want, take things in whatever direction I want, was really the key for me. It's something that you don't get in video games. The teams are too large, the projects are too big, the money invested in them is too high to just have one person make all the decisions and do everything they want exactly how they want. There's always give and take, and you can make incredible products with that. But on some level, I think most creative people want to have the chance to just have complete creative control and take their own shot and see what comes out. So that's for me what Children of Fire is. It's my opportunity to show myself what I can do if I have complete creative control. And fortunately, let's say a lot of people like it. It's now being nominated as some of the early sort of reviews or early nominations for best fantasy novels are coming out, and it's got a couple nominations already. RT Book Reviews has picked it as one of their nominees for best epic fantasy novel. So it seems like people like it. That's very gratifying. And as much as I love Star Wars, Mass Effect, and all those other projects I worked on, they weren't mine. They're not my children, for want of a better word. Whereas Children of Fire, the Chaosborn trilogy, it's mine. It's always going to be a closer relationship than I had with anything else because I created it. It's completely mine, and I'm closer to it than I am to any other project.
So in my experience interviewing authors like yourself, a lot of their personal projects have been in their head for years and years and years. How long has this project actually been bouncing around in your head?
Yeah, exactly. Years and years and years. The very first sort of efforts I made at the Children of Fire novel or this trilogy was something I actually started doing in my last year of high school. You know, I was reading a lot of epic fantasy at the time, a lot of Terry Brooks, a lot of David Eddings, and I was very inspired to try my own hand at it. Of course, being in high school, I didn't have the sort of the experience as a writer. You know, you have to it takes a long time to really get your skills where they need to be. So I came up with some ideas and some stories, and I wrote some chapters. And I mean, they were terrible, of course, but that's sort of where the seeds of this story came from. And then over the next, 20 years, 25 years before it actually eventually came out, I would kind of keep going back to it and redoing it and refining it and changing things and working things in, and stuff I'd learned as an author, stuff I'd learned as just a creative person working on even science fiction, fantasy, anything I worked on. I would bring it to the project in little bits and pieces, and at some point I realized I was ready, and that's when I left BioWare and I decided, I think I'm ready to tackle this creation of my own universe and my own story and get something out there to readers that will really resonate with them.
Okay, so that leads into a question that I wasn't going to ask, but if some of our listeners keep on persisting that it must be true. So is it safe to say that it is in fact true that you did not in fact leave BioWare because you disagreed with the ending of Mass Effect 3's direction?
No, that was not. That had nothing to do with it. So I actually left the Mass Effect team toward the end of Mass Effect 2. And I moved down to Austin to work on the Old Republic game. So that was already planned. And part of the reason was even at that time, I was looking to dial back. Once I moved down to Austin, I was not the lead of the project. I was not the lead on the Old Republic, so I was able to start focusing a little bit more on my own things. And I actually went down to, for a little while I was only working part-time at BioWare. I wasn't working full-time. And then I kind of slowly dwindled off that too, and came down to the point where I just finally retired. So it had nothing to do with that. It was really the reason I'm not with BioWare anymore is because just creatively, I felt like I wanted to try my own thing. I was a little bit burned out working on games. It's a great industry, but it's very demanding. It's exhausting. You put in many, many, many hours of overtime. There's a lot of stress involved in making something incredible like a Mass Effect. There's a lot of different people pushing and pulling on you, fans and producers and other members of your team. We had 100 people on the Mass Effect team, and everybody, has their own ideas. So you're always kind of, in a good way, having these battles of creative will that, hash out something that works for everybody. But it is a bit draining. It is a bit tiring. And at some point after, 10, 11 years in the industry, I was kind of ready to try something else. I don't know if I'm ever going to go back to video games. I might. I enjoyed it a lot. I might even go back to BioWare someday. I really don't know. I left on very good terms. I still have a lot of friends there. I still think very highly of the company, and the party was extremely amicable. It had nothing to do with my displeasure of anything that the company's done.
Awesome. Maybe they'll hire you back when BioWare decides to make their own movies themselves, like Ubisoft is making their own films with.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have one more question about writing, and then we're going to wrap this up.
Sure.
So last question about writing is a lot of our listeners like writing. We actually have like a little like writing contest going on right now. So when it comes to writing, what are some tactics you have for creating certain moods and so on? Like some writers have said they use music, especially to create, action. They use like rock and so on. Some people, say they write outside. Some people write at night. What are some tactics you use to create different moods in your writing and to get the juices flowing?
So for music, sometimes I will have a little bit of music playing in the background. Sometimes I won't. It really just depends what kind of a mood I'm in. I don't necessarily use that to inspire me. But sometimes I just like to have it kind of in the background. But for me, it's just general. I just put the radio on and listen to the radio. And for me, it's just kind of, mainstream rock alternative. It's sort of my band of choice. But that's more just to sort of be a background white noise distraction. For me, I do almost all of my writing at night. usually after my wife has gone to bed. I tend to stay up very late. I think a lot of writers do. I'm not a morning person. Most of my writing will happen after midnight. I have an office that, I have the blinds shut, the doors closed. I have one tiny little lamp. Everything around me is very, very dark. And I like to feel like the outside world is kind of dissolved away into the darkness. I'm in my own little bubble of light, and the only thing are me, my computer, and the words on the screen. And, that's how I sort of get into it and focus. And it helps to take away the outside world, leaving this blackness that I feel like I'm compelled to fill with my own, ideas and words and visions. In a perfect world, I do this 2 or 3 hours a night, 3 or 4 nights a week, three weeks a month, and I'd have a book out every year with no problem. What really happens is I'll go weeks and weeks doing almost nothing and procrastinating, and then I panic, and then I go, 4 or 5 hours a night for a month, and I get a lot of work done, and then I kind of dial back, and then my deadline comes, and I go into panic mode. So I think that's pretty common for a lot of writers, which isn't maybe the best way to do it, but I think I need that pressure of a deadline to really sort of push me to do my best work.
So are you ever in awe when someone like Kevin Anderson writes 6 novels a year?
Yeah, it's something that I have a little trouble wrapping my head around. I've done novels quickly. The second Dark Bane novel was actually sort of a weird situation where there was something else planned that fell through, and they came to me and said, we need to get a novel published by this time frame. Can you write it in 3 months? And I was like, okay, I'll do that. And I was still working at BioWare at the time. We were actually in crunch time on, I believe, the first Mass Effect game, if I remember right. So I wrote, I wrote that novel in 3 months while I was working 60 to 80 hours a week. And it just about killed me. And I thought, wow, I don't know. I don't know if I could do this. And I know there are writers who write, 5-6 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I admire them. I'm in awe of them. But, I can't do that. So, it really is about finding what works for you, though. And there is something to be said for just getting into the habit of sitting your ass down in the chair and sitting in front of the keyboard and writing. Don't surf the net. Open your Word doc or whatever you use as your writing tool, and stare at that blank screen until your fingers start clicking away. If you do that, something will come out.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. So the last question that we ask every single guest. We're going to give you the soapbox so that you can promote any upcoming appearances, any upcoming releases. You can even we have a person rant for about 20 minutes, but you can even just tell the fans whatever you want to tell them. You have the soapbox now to promote or sing whatever you'd like to our listeners.
All right. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell fans who haven't picked it up to really check out Children of Fire. This is the first book in my epic fantasy trilogy, The Chaosborn. If you like Game of Thrones, George Martin, or Terry Brooks, or Brandon Sanderson, I think you're really going to like these novels. They have that kind of classic fantasy feel. They are in some ways a little bit reminiscent of, say, my Dark Bane novels. There's a little bit of a darker side to them. I keep the action moving. Anyone who's read any of my books knows that I like to keep things moving along very briskly. There's a lot of kinetic energy in my novels. I think fans, and I understand why, fans who are fans of, say, Star Wars or Mass Effect are maybe leery about picking up this new series because it is fantasy. It's a little different, but it still, I think, captures sort of the wonder of all my other novels. If you like my writing style, you're really going to love Children of Fire because it really is sort of an opportunity for me to just do everything I've always wanted to do in telling a story. The other big thing about it is, and I understand this, people are reluctant to get into a trilogy because, or a series of books because they're worried it might take years and years. I've already finished the second book. It's coming out in July, and I'm already starting on the third book. So I'm personally vowing to fans that they won't have to wait more than 18 months to get the completion of this trilogy. And it is a trilogy. It's all plotted out. I've planned everything in great detail. It's going to finish at 3 books. It's not going to leave you hanging. I'm not going to string it out into 5 books. So I think fans can take confidence knowing that if they pick up this book, they're going to get a great epic fantasy story that they won't have to wait a decade to find out how it ends.
Or 20 years or more when it comes to Game of Thrones. Holy crap, finish that series, Mr. Martin. Okay, well, thank you very much. This has been fantastic. Our listeners are going to be enthralled.
Oh, awesome. I really appreciate it, Chairman.
And thank you for, that we're able to find time, because I know last year we tried, but you were quite busy.
I was kind of in a little panic mode trying to get some of the stuff done. And now that I've been away from BioWare a little longer, I've kind of learned how to juggle my time a little better. So.
Well, thank you very much, sir, and we'll send this to you as soon as it's up.
That sounds great.
So thank you very much, and I hope you have the best of days.
All right, awesome. And if for whatever reason you guys need anything else, you got my email contact, you know how to get in touch with me. And then, looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.